Do you still believe the United States is the world's greatest economic power? That American capitalism remains the model of success the rest of the world should follow? Then it might be time to reconsider those assumptions. What's coming is worse than any recession you've ever heard of. And most people don't even realize how big the problem really is. The collapse won't be televised with sirens, nor will it be announced by smiling politicians. It's already underway, quietly, invisibly, to the eyes of those who still believe in the old American dream. But the signs are everywhere. Record inequality, stagnant wages, unsustainable debt, rising military tensions, and a paralyzed political system. In this video, you'll understand why the American empire is falling, not by accident, but as part of a predictable historical process. And more importantly, why no one at the top wants you to see it. We'll talk about economics, history, geopolitics, and most importantly, how all of this directly impacts your life. I'm Mr. Monny, economist and financial educator, and I dedicate this channel to opening the eyes of those who want to understand what's really behind the numbers. If you want to see beyond the smokescreen and build your own worldview, subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and get ready, because what's coming next is simply inevitable. The cycle of empires, history repeats itself. What's happening in the United States today is neither isolated nor unprecedented. In fact, it's the repetition of a very old pattern. Throughout history, great empires have risen, dominated the world for a time, and then collapsed. All of them, without exception. The Roman Empire, the Egyptian, the Persian, the Chinese, the Ottoman, more recently, the British Empire, all followed the same cycle: birth, rise, peak, decline, and what marked the end of each of them? A combination of internal factors, inequality, economic crises, excessive militarism, corruption, and the rise of new competitors. The American empire rose from the ashes of the British Empire. It gained strength after World War II, consolidated itself as the absolute superpower during the Cold War, and reached its peak in the 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union. But since then, the signs of decay have only multiplied. The machine that once seemed unstoppable now creaks. Like the empires of the past, the United States began to ignore the warnings. The political and economic elite came to believe that power was eternal, that American leadership was natural, unquestionable, almost divine. And when the first signs of decline appeared, the rise of China, the strengthening of the BRICS, even internal crises, the response was always the same: denial. This behavior isn't unique to Americans. The British Empire, for example, also denied the loss of its global influence for decades. By the time it realized the truth, it was too late. And that brings us to an uncomfortable question. What stage is the American empire in today? If we apply the same criteria used for past empires, political instability, collapse of the middle class, rising internal violence, institutional decay, and loss of global influence, the answer is clear. The United States is in an advanced stage of decline. And here, it's important to highlight a key difference between the fall of past empires and what we're experiencing now: scale. Never before in human history has an empire held so much economic, military, and cultural power as the US. So, its collapse won't be just local. It will affect the entire planet. But just like with previous empires, the beginning of the end isn't marked by a single crisis or event. It reveals itself through a series of small cracks that build up until one irreversible fracture splits everything apart. And that fracture, in America's case, is already there, but almost no one wants to look at it. Next, we'll understand how this collapse began to take shape within the very economic system the US created and exported to the world: capitalism, a system that, for decades, operated with a clear promise and is now failing precisely where it was supposed to deliver the greatest results. The culture of denial in the US. The collapse of an empire doesn't happen without resistance, but that resistance is not always rational. Most of the time, it comes in the form of denial, a collective refusal to accept reality. And in the United States, that denial has become official policy, market ideology, and even a way of life. Political leaders from both parties, influential economists, major business figures, and the mainstream media, they all repeat, almost ritualistically, that the US is still the world's largest economy, the land of opportunity, and a beacon of freedom. It's a beautiful, powerful, comforting narrative, but one that is increasingly detached from the reality experienced by most citizens. This denial shows up in many forms: ignoring wage stagnation, downplaying inequality, blaming external forces for internal crises, and even fabricating enemies such as immigrants, unions, or rival nations to justify what people refuse to face. The curious part is that all the data is publicly available. The crisis is visible, but the elite keeps repeating slogans. Why? Because accepting reality would mean acting on it. And acting, in this case, would require challenging powerful interests, reassessing privileges, and changing the system, something the true beneficiaries of the empire have no intention of doing. This kind of denial isn't just irrational, it's dangerous. The longer the problem is denied, the worse it becomes. Like a patient who refuses to get tested out of fear of the diagnosis, American society avoids confronting its economic, social, and political symptoms. But collapse doesn't wait. And when the system starts to break down, it's not those at the top who suffer first. It's those at the bottom. Workers, debt-ridden families, young people with no prospects, marginalized immigrants. These are the groups who feel the weight of denial the hardest. And it's exactly here that we begin to see the clearest signs of the system's failure. Up next, we'll examine the central mechanism behind all of this: how American capitalism, which once promised prosperity for all, ended up creating a cycle of wealth concentration and mass abandonment. Wealth for the few, stagnation for the many. If there's a driving force behind both the rise and now the decline of the American empire, that force is capitalism. But not just any capitalism. We're talking about a highly concentrated model that, over the last 40 years, has transferred wealth from the hands of millions into the pockets of a few. Since 1980, there's been a profound reconfiguration of income distribution in the United States. While the richest 10% saw their fortunes multiply, the middle class shrank, and the poorest were pushed further into the margins of survival. Today, the top 1% holds more than 30% of the country's total wealth. The top 0.1% owns nearly as much as the bottom 90%. That's not imbalance, it's a collapse in the making. But how did this happen? First, there was a deliberate shift in tax laws. Over decades, the government lowered taxes for the wealthy and for corporations, while increasing the burden on workers and small businesses. And this shift was driven by both political parties, Democrats and Republicans alike. At the same time, real wages stagnated. From 1870 to 1970, American workers saw their earnings consistently rise. It was a century of growth, where the promise of capitalism seemed to hold. Corporate profits went up, and so did wages. There was, despite its flaws, a certain balance between capital and labor. But starting in the 1970s, that logic broke. Average wages, adjusted for inflation, stopped growing. Today, the average American worker earns about the same as they did in 1978, but with much higher living costs. Education, healthcare, housing, and transportation have all become more expensive, but wages remained flat. How did families respond? First, by sending more women into the workforce. Then, by taking on debt, credit cards, mortgages, student loans. People kept consuming not because they earned more, but because they borrowed more. This model created the illusion of prosperity. Shopping malls were full, consumer spending looked strong, and growth metrics seemed healthy. But behind it all was a financial time bomb. Families spending more than they earned, propping up the system with credit. Meanwhile, at the top, corporations reaped record profits. Not only were they paying fewer taxes, but they also began rewarding executives with billion-dollar bonuses, buying back shares to artificially inflate market value, and cutting worker benefits. Moreover, with technological advances, worker productivity skyrocketed. We produce more with less effort. But the gains from that productivity were not shared with workers. They were captured by capital. This is the heart of the crisis. The economy grew, technology advanced, companies got richer, but the average worker was left behind. And worse, this wasn't an accident. It was a choice made by a system that prioritizes profit above all, that measures success by stock prices, not by people's quality of life, that protects fortunes and punishes hard work. That claims to be a meritocracy, but where your birthplace matters more than your talent. And that choice came with a heavy cost, the destruction of social trust. Today, millions of Americans no longer believe that if you work hard, you'll succeed, because they see the reality around them. People juggling 2 or 3 jobs, buried in debt, exhausted, while billionaires pay less tax than their drivers. And that frustration, which started in the wallet, is already turning into a silent revolt. A growing tension that may, and will, erupt in unpredictable ways. In the next chapter, we'll look at the direct consequences of this model: the collapse of families, the explosion of medication use, emotional deterioration, and how all of this helped fuel the crisis that exploded in 2008. The illusion of consumption, debt, and family collapse. As inequality grew and real wages remained stagnant, Americans desperately sought ways to maintain the lifestyle they had been promised. The American dream had to be sustained, even if only on the surface, and that's when consumption became a trap. The first reaction from families was to put every adult to work. Millions of women who had traditionally stayed at home now entered full-time jobs. But this economic shift had deep social effects. Emotional overload, lack of time for children, constant tension between work and home. All of it began to erode the core that held private life together. The second reaction was mass indebtedness. With wages frozen and prices climbing, families began to replace income with credit. What was once a privilege of the wealthy, like American Express cards, became widespread. Credit cards were handed out to nearly everyone. The message was clear: if you can't afford it, borrow. This strategy worked. To a point. For years, consumption was artificially maintained through loans for homes, cars, education, vacations. The economy appeared to be running smoothly, but in reality, families were digging themselves into a deeper hole. And the effects of this pressure were devastating. The U.S. began to record the highest divorce rates in the world. Use of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications skyrocketed, especially among women, now burdened with the roles of provider, mother, spouse, and caregiver. The home, once the emotional anchor of American life, turned into a constant pressure zone. And when emotional systems collapse, the economic system soon follows. Unstable families are more prone to poverty, school dropout, addiction, and crime. Then came 2008. The financial crisis didn't come out of nowhere. It was the logical result of decades spent encouraging families to consume with money they didn't have. The banking system, hungry for profit, extended credit recklessly. And when the foundation gave way, with mass mortgage defaults, the bubble burst. Millions lost their homes, jobs, and savings. Trust in the system was deeply shaken. But the most important lesson was ignored. You cannot sustain an empire on personal debt. Debt-fueled consumption is a house of cards, and it already collapsed once. And despite all this, the same pattern continued. Instead of rethinking the model, the system doubled down. More credit, more precarious labor, more emotional and financial dependency. And the price continues to be paid by ordinary families, while the true culprits keep profiting. In the next chapter, we'll examine how the 2008 crisis exposed the rotten foundations of American capitalism, and why it was only the first sign that something much bigger is failing. The 2008 crisis and a system in ruins. To many, the 2008 crisis was an unexpected accident. But for those paying attention, it was inevitable. The logical outcome of decades fueling an economy based on debt, speculation, and denial of reality. In the years leading up to the crash, U.S. banks offered credit to virtually anyone. Mortgages were granted without proper income verification. Toxic assets were packaged and sold as safe investment. And all of it happened with the approval, or neglect, of the government and regulatory institution. When the defaults began, the house of cards collapsed in a domino effect. Millions lost their homes. Banks failed. Companies laid off workers in droves. The stock market melted down. What had been sold as a stable economy revealed itself as a rotting structure held together by empty promises. But the worst part was the system's response. Instead of punishing the guilty or reforming the model, the government bailed out the big banks with public money. While entire families lost everything, Wall Street was rescued and quickly returned to record profits. The message was clear. The system is not designed to protect you. It's designed to protect its owners. Even worse, no structural reform was enacted. The profit at all costs mentality remained untouched. Banks stayed too big to fail. Household debt continued to rise. Labor conditions worsened, and wages stayed frozen. The 2008 crisis should have been a turning point, but it was just another ignored crack in the empire, a missed opportunity to reevaluate the system. And when you ignore a structural failure, it only comes back stronger. And it did. Inequality grew, living costs exploded, and the American worker, already exhausted, now carries not just the debt, but also the frustration and disillusionment. In the next chapter, we'll understand how this structural inequality has deepened even further, and how the exploitation of labor continues to sustain a system that benefits only a privileged minority at the top. The cost of inequality and social despair. If 2008 exposed the system's flaws, the decade that followed revealed something even more disturbing. Inequality not only persisted, it intensified. Even after one of the worst financial crises in history, the rich became even richer, and the working class continued to sink. The promise of American capitalism was always simple. If you work hard, you'll be rewarded. But the reality of the last 40 years has been the opposite. Workers are more productive than ever, thanks to automation, technology, and intensified workloads. But wages remain stagnant. All productivity gains were captured by a tiny minority at the top. This creates a kind of silent suffering. People work harder, deliver more, sacrifice health and time with family, but can't get ahead. It erodes the sense of fairness, destroys self-esteem, and turns frustration into anger. And when that anger has no constructive outlet, it turns into social despair. Outbursts of violence, rising drug use, mental health disorders, increasing crime, political radicalization. The social fabric begins to tear, and people start seeing each other as enemies, when in truth, they're all victims of the same system. Meanwhile, corporations continue to expand their profits, and to maintain the illusion of stability, they deploy false narratives to justify the chaos. They blame immigration, lazy, poor people, young people who don't want to work. All of it serves to distract from the real cause, a system that concentrates wealth and distributes misery. This inequality also manifests in something even more dangerous: hopelessness. Millions of people no longer believe their efforts make any difference, and when a country loses hope, it loses its future. What's most alarming is that even in the face of such obvious signs, the system continues to operate the same way. Workers bear the burden of high interest rates, inflation, soaring rent, and expensive food, while speculative capital rides the bubble. And the government, which could act to balance the scales, plays the role of accomplice. It protects billionaire privileges, cuts social programs, and represses protests. The state becomes a tool of the elite, abandoning its function of safeguarding collective well-being. This is the hallmark of a collapsing empire, when inequality stops being a flaw in the system and becomes the foundation of the system. When the suffering of the majority isn't a mistake, but a functional mechanism for maintaining the privilege of a few. In the next chapter, we'll look at how this situation connects to a not-so-distant past, and why the history of Germany's working class offers a dark warning for what may be coming in the United States. The Germany Effect: What History Teaches Us. When a society begins to collapse, economically, socially, and morally, historical parallels become unavoidable. And perhaps the most disturbing example is that of 20th century Germany. At the end of World War I, Germany was defeated and humiliated with heavy war debts. The German Empire fell apart, and the country plunged into one of the worst inflations in history. In a matter of months, the currency's value evaporated. Families who had saved for generations saw their life savings turn to dust. A loaf of bread could cost trillions of marks. The working class, which had believed in the promise of national rebuilding, was economically crushed. But the tragedy didn't stop there. Just a few years later came the Great Depression of 1929. Mass unemployment, hunger, and hopelessness created an explosive environment, and it was in that exact context that a figure emerged, promising to restore lost dignity: Adolf Hitler. Nazism didn't come from nowhere. It was born out of despair, out of the pain of a betrayed working class, out of the denial of an elite that refused to see the warning signs, and out of a society that, having lost hope in the future, clung to any narrative offering order, identity, and revenge. Today, the United States faces a similar cycle: a system slowly collapsing, a vanishing middle class, disillusioned youth, exhausted workers, and like Germany in the 1930s, space is opening for radical, simplistic, and dangerous rhetoric. We're not saying the U.S. will literally follow the same path, but ignoring the parallels is playing with fire. Because when collective suffering finds no rational way out, it turns to emotional, and often destructive, alternatives. History teaches, but only those willing to listen. And if the United States continues down this road, deepening inequality, ignoring the symptoms, and fueling mass frustration, it should come as no surprise if despair turns into something even darker. In the next chapter, we'll shift focus outward to understand how the rise of China is accelerating this process, and why, for the first time in decades, the American empire now has a real competitor. China is replacing the U.S., and fast. As the United States faces internal decline, a new power is rising, quietly but steadily. China is no longer preparing to compete with the U.S. It is already competing, and in many areas, it has already surpassed it. For decades, the West treated China as a developing country, useful as the global factory for cheap products. But while the United States spent trillions on wars, China invested in infrastructure, technology, education, and long-term planning. The result? An average growth rate of 6% to 9% annually over the last 3 decades, compared to the U.S.'s modest 2%. Today, China's GDP is nearly equal to that of the United States, and in some areas, like industrial output, exports, and clean energy investments, it already leads. In the tech sector, Chinese companies like Huawei, BYD, and Tencent rival Silicon Valley giants. Platforms like TikTok have dominated the Western world, showing that the cultural and digital war is already underway, and the US is losing. But the most impressive thing isn't the numbers, it's the trend. While the US faces stagnation, China continues its upward trajectory. The country is building global trade routes through the Belt and Road Initiative, expanding influence across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, signing strategic trade agreements, and developing alternatives to the US dollar and the Western-controlled financial system. And how has the US responded? With fear. Instead of adapting, the US chose confrontation, tariffs, sanctions, trade wars, tech restrictions. None of these strategies worked. China kept advancing. And now, the confrontation is turning military. The US naval presence in the South China Sea is no coincidence. It's a clear sign that the American empire sees China's rise as a direct threat to its global hegemony. But here's the problem. You can't win the future with strategies from the past. The world has changed. Globalization has been reshaped. And China is no longer asking for permission. It is setting the rules of the new game. Meanwhile, the US continues to act as if it were the 1990s, believing it can maintain dominance based on past glory. But power now lies elsewhere. And all signs suggest that the world's center of gravity is shifting, from Washington to Beijing. In the next chapter, we'll examine how the US, instead of accepting this new reality, decided to escalate its offensive, using the war in Ukraine as a stage and attempting to weaken China's main ally, Russia. Sanctions, war, and the failure of the American strategy. Faced with China's rise, the United States sought an indirect strategy to contain its growth. Target the weakest link in the China-Russia alliance, Russia. This is where the war in Ukraine takes on a much deeper geopolitical role than it appears. The official narrative says the US and its allies are defending Ukrainian democracy against authoritarian invasion. But behind that noble rhetoric lies a strategic reality. Weakening Russia means isolating China. The plan was simple: harsh sanctions, economic blockade, political isolation. The goal? Collapse Russia's economy in a matter of weeks and erase its global influence. But nothing went as planned. Instead of sinking, Russia found new markets. China increased its energy imports. India continued buying discounted oil. Countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and even Brazil began adopting a more independent stance. The result? The American strategy failed. Moreover, many nations, even longtime US allies, refused to blindly follow the sanction. In the UN vote, dozens of countries abstained, a clear sign that American influence is no longer absolute. Domestically, the war also takes its toll. Continuous arms shipments, billions in funding, rising inflation, and higher living costs due to destabilized energy markets. And who pays the price? Once again, ordinary people. And the most alarming part, the US achieved none of its key objectives. Russia wasn't isolated. The war drags on. The Russian economy, despite the pressure, remains resilient. And its alliance with China has only grown stronger. This attempt to maintain hegemony through force using proxy conflicts reflects the same logic of collapsing empires, attacking abroad to distract from internal decay. But every miscalculated move only accelerates the erosion of US global power. In the next chapter, we'll explore how America's constant reliance on military power, even against smaller nations, has become a failed strategy that merely exposes the growing fragility of the American empire. Militarism and the risk of global war. When an empire's economic and diplomatic influence begins to decline, the final card is often military power. And that's exactly what we're seeing now from the United States. Unable to stop China's rise or isolate Russia with sanctions, The U.S. is escalating its confrontational military strategy, directly or through intermediaries. Since the end of World War II, the U.S. has invaded dozens of countries in the name of democracy, freedom, or national security. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, all these wars came at a massive human and economic cost, and all of them, without exception, ended in strategic failure. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 was the most recent example. After 20 years, billions of dollars, and thousands of lives lost, the U.S. handed the country back to the very group it had vowed to defeat, the Taliban. It was a symbolic moment, an empire retreating from its own illusion of control. Now, the same pattern is repeating in the South China Sea, where the U.S. 7th Fleet patrols waters near China's coastline. No Chinese fleet is parked off the coast of California, but the U.S. insists on maintaining a military presence at the doorstep of its main rival. It's like playing with matches near gunpowder. The risk is real. A conflict between the U.S. and China would not be localized. It would be a global war with unpredictable consequences. We're not just talking about conventional weapons, but also cyber warfare, nuclear capabilities, and economic warfare. A collision between the world's two superpowers would be a catastrophe with no winners. So why stay on this path? Because militarism has become part of American identity. Because questioning the Pentagon's budget is taboo. Because the military-industrial complex profits from war and funds political campaigns. And because war often serves as a convenient distraction from internal crises no one wants to confront. In the next chapter, we'll uncover a rarely discussed truth. While the U.S. maintains its aggressive posture, its economic dependence on China is growing. And this may be quietly undermining the very foundations of American power from within. The weight of debt and America's new dependency. Amid all the rhetoric of strength and global leadership, there's an uncomfortable fact rarely mentioned in headlines. The United States is now one of the most indebted nations on Earth, and a significant portion of that debt is held by its main geopolitical rival, China. Currently, the U.S. government owes over $800 billion to China in treasury bonds. This means that year after year, American taxpayers pay taxes that are, in part, sent to Beijing, in the form of interest on public debt. Money that, ironically, helps fund Chinese infrastructure, universities, technological development, and even the strengthening of China's military. This creates a brutal paradox. While the U.S. invests trillions in weapons to contain China, it is simultaneously transferring wealth to it. And this dependency goes beyond treasury bonds. China is also the leading supplier of industrial inputs, low-cost technology, and even strategic materials like rare earth elements. In other words, the U.S. is trapped in a web of its own making. It needs China economically, yet confronts it geopolitically. It's a dangerous and unstable game. In the next chapter, we'll explore how this structural crisis is affecting an entire generation of young Americans who no longer believe in the promises of capitalism and are searching for new answers, even if they don't yet know where to find them. The youth is waking up and rejecting capitalism. Economic collapse doesn't just affect numbers and graphs, it shapes mindset. And one of the deepest changes is happening among young Americans. An entire generation grew up being told that if they just studied, worked hard, and stayed disciplined, they would succeed, only to realize it was all an illusion. They see their parents and grandparents who bought homes on average salaries, retired with stability, and managed to build some wealth. And they ask themselves, why doesn't that work for me anymore? Today, even with college degrees, many young people face crushing student debt, low wages, unaffordable rent, and zero hope of retirement. This quiet frustration is sparking a surprising phenomenon: the revival of criticism toward capitalism. Recent polls, like those from Gallup, show that a majority of Americans under 35 say they prefer to live under a socialist system, even if they don't fully understand what that means. But the point isn't a direct shift to socialism. It's the conscious rejection of today's capitalism, which has proven unsustainable, exclusionary, and unequal. The system promised prosperity, but delivered anxiety, promised freedom, but delivered death. In this void of hope, new ideas emerge, along with new movements and radical narratives, both progressive and authoritarian. Because where there's desperation, there's fertile ground for any ideology that offers quick answers to deep problems. In the next chapter, we'll explore why the only real force capable of changing this scenario doesn't lie in palaces, but in factories, offices, and the streets. In other words, the working class itself. Only the working class can change this. For a long time, we were sold the idea that change comes from the top, that we just needed to elect the right leaders, trust the market, follow the rules. But time has shown that those at the top have no interest in changing anything. Why? Because the current system benefits them, and those who profit from the game rarely want to change the rules. Meanwhile, the only real force for change lies at the bottom, in that silent majority that works, produces, pays taxes, and holds the country together. In short, the working class. It's the workers who keep the factories running, hospitals functioning, deliveries moving, and systems operating. They fund the state through their taxes. They shoulder the burdens of crises created by an elite that plays without consequence. Historically, every major social transformation has come from below, never from above. It was organized workers who won 8-hour workdays, civil rights, pensions, health care, minimum wages. And if anything is going to change in the United States, it will have to come from them again. But for that to happen, we must break free from apathy, division, and the idea that everyone must fight alone. We must recover the sense of collectivity, solidarity, and shared purpose. Because the way things are, the system will keep extracting everything it can, until there's nothing left. In the final chapter, we'll close this analysis with a reflection on what's truly at stake, and why denying reality is more dangerous than facing it. Denial never protected anyone. Denying reality never protected anyone. It only delays the impact. The American empire is in decline. The data is there, the signs are visible, and history has already shown us how this ends. The only question left is, what will we do with this knowledge? Ignoring the collapse is letting it drag us down with it, but facing it head-on is a chance to rethink everything. Our economy, our priorities, our role as a society. This isn't about rooting against the United States or romanticizing other systems. It's about recognizing that a model based on exploitation, inequality, and permanent war is unsustainable, both morally and economically. And yes, change may seem impossible, but every change begins with awareness, with seeing what's wrong, with rejecting comforting lies, with sharing the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. If you've made it this far, it's because you also feel that something needs to change. And believe me, you are not alone. Millions think like you. They just haven't yet found the right spaces to connect, organize, and act. That's why I invite you. Like this video, subscribe to the Mr. Monny channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Information is the first spark, and every spark can ignite a movement. The journey toward a new future doesn't begin in Washington or Wall Street. It begins with you.